G'day from Wurundjeri country. I'm Michelle Macklem. For today, I thought I would start with the end. Very natural. And by the end, I mean the end of a music cue, because I think this provides this really nice moment in sound design to highlight pacing or create punctuation through sound that can help elevate text and the dialogue that's going on in a podcast project or other narrative sound project. So I thought I would first start off by talking about why and where I specifically end a music cue, so kind of like my intention, and then 3 different techniques that I commonly use to end those cues. So let's dive in. Okay, the why and the where of ending a music cue. So there are a bunch of different approaches, but for me and how I generally approach it is to think of music as punctuation. So how can it elevate the storytelling and help create a sense of pacing or space or kind of like end a specific thing that's happening in the greater story? So I like to be really intentional about how I end or use music these days. And I think there can be so many different techniques and reasons why you end it. But most of all, for me, it's about using sound to be like another piece in the puzzle that brings the story together. So I'm going to hop into this session here and show you how I kind of think about music in relation to this script. And in particular, how I think of it as punctuating and kind of breaking up specific paragraphs. So I'll bring up the script also. So this is the script of this specific section here. I'll make my session smaller so you can see both. So here we go.
That means your documentary subject already knows and probably likes you, so ideally they're then primed to bare their soul to you. My first ever documentary subject was my childhood neighbor Nicola, who at the time was a 16-year-old Olympic-bound gymnast, on the verge of retiring because of a long-standing hip injury. When I asked Nicola if she'd be up for me documenting this transitional time in her life, she said sure. Actually, she said that having a record of this time sounded really valuable to her.
So for me, I think by remembering what I've been through.
Okay, so for me, this is a pretty standard, like I use music to create a bit of momentum as the paragraph changed from one idea, shifted into another, and got a bit more specific about the documentary in this case. That's when I brought music in and out. And so it was out by the time that the subject was actually speaking. And what I really liked in this case, in terms of using the script, is to actually write it in so the whole team can see my kind of intention and why I would bring music in and out in these particular instances. So that generally works well. I like to write all of my kind of cues. Again, a music cue is just something you would call like this particular song you're using in the placement of your session in the story. This is a good example as we transition into the next topic because on the specific kind of music out here, cue out, it is a nice clap sound. So it punctuates a bit more. And what I think that does is kind of signal to the listener, oh, we're like turning the ear a bit. So we're like changing to a new subject, scene, location. And it just kind of like tweaks the attention that much more that there's something to listen for rather than just kind of a flat continuing of the story. We have a nice little clap with a little bit of reverb on it. And so reverb is the technique that we're going to hit up first. Let's go over to that. All right, technique 1, we've got the reverb tail. So reverb tail, pretty simply, is just adding a little bit of reverb onto the end of a piece of music, so your music cue, and that's to give it a bit of transition, flow, the sense of space before you go back into the story or speaking, what have you. And I like to do it in a way that's quite subtle. I think there's a multitude of different ways to do it for many different reasons. But in this case, I find I'm hearing a lot that reverb's kind of uses in this like blast off to space big sound, and often applying it subtly sounds really, really lovely and can be a nice way of tying in like the timing of the music with the reverb. And so also the reverb doesn't sound like super cut off when your dialogue comes back in. So first we're going to listen back to these tracks without any reverb, and we can hear how it sounds. So we've got voiceover, interview track, kind of atmospheric soundtrack, and then 2 music tracks here. So let's take a listen.
I keep going and I'm still trying my best and my coach still isn't liking it.
Eventually, we got to Nicola's physical breaking point.
I just thought, okay, this is it. Like,
All right, as fun as an abrupt stop is, let's create a little bit of transition there so it sounds like we're not just dropping the mic. There's something happening in the story, or it sounds like a mistake. In this case, in Reaper, I'm going to apply it as an item effect onto this specific, or I guess a take effect onto this specific item. You can apply it on the whole track. You could apply it in a specific section kind of way. But in this case, I'm going as a take effect method because I do find that it is nice for adjusting later. And if I end up moving stuff around in my session, things don't get messy. So to start off, I'm going to just apply some reverb onto this piece of music here. It's our cello ascending slide 1. Let's just take a listen. So I'm going to bring up my effect here. What I've got is this reverb called Oral River, and it's really nice because it is free and it sounds lovely. So this is a good resource to have for reverbs if you're feeling like you don't want to break the bank. But I did want to use a free one in this case because I think it doesn't need to be expensive and complicated to sound really nice. And this is a good example. So the thing with this reverb is it can look kind of like daunting when it first comes up. You're like, decay time and what gain or room size. You could play around with these different inputs, but honestly, the biggest thing to kind of start off with is just this one fader, and this is the wet fader here. So this kind of controls the amount of reverb you're applying onto that specific piece of music, and that's what we want to change. We don't need to touch a bunch of other settings at this stage. We can just focus on this one element. If you want to go deeper, 100% go for it. Oftentimes, there is not time. And I think doing that learning is really, really important. And also, sometimes you just got to work fast. So, most commonly, I'm just working with like the wet, dry mix function, and then probably an EQ, and then changing the decay time. But in this case, like it's more than enough to just work with the wet and dry fader here. So, I'm going to bring up the parameters of this plugin. You can do that in a few different ways, but if we hover over this like 3-dot automation thing here, that's our take envelopes window. And I'm just going to scroll down to where it says wet. So you can see a few things have happened. It's active, lit up. The line says negative 15 dB. And what else says that? Our fader does. So these two things are aligned. As I bring this up and start to play it back, you'll see that this fader changes. So negative 15 is kind of a nice place to be. I think that's a good starting place for me with this plugin. Like it's by no means gospel. I just arranged it that way. But like let's hear what it sounds like if we do a full reverb blast off and just bring it up to 0. So you can kind of hear. So you can hear it's pretty dramatic, it's pretty big, and we just don't need that much reverb. Like it just doesn't sound in characteristic with all the other elements happening. So I'm going to bring it back down. I'm going to bring it further than negative 12, and I'm just going to draw on a couple of dot points here and create a little bit of an arc. So this is our tail. And let's listen back. Yeah, so a lot more subtle. I'll just arrange it a bit more. And again, you can watch the fader if you want. So the reverb's pretty much out by the time this dialogue is coming back in, which is also nice. So it doesn't have that kind of cut off sense that the reverb is still playing back and then the dialogue comes in and kind of cuts it off. So let's play back within the session and hear how it sounds.
Yeah.
Eventually, we got to Nicola's physical breaking point.
I just thought, okay, this
Great. So the reverb essentially ends before the speaker comes back in. It's sounding really smooth and it's not too much. So I'm pretty happy with that. There's a few things that I could do when I'm working until something's finalized. Honestly, I'd probably leave it till like I would not render this. But what you could do is also render this with the effect on it. That's going to be similar to like what a Pro Tools audio suite function would do. So if I do render it, a couple different ways I could do that, but you can just right click on this and make sure if you're doing apply, take, and track effects to this, you want to choose multi-channel because we have 2 channels here. So that's like 2 channels just means it's stereo because we want that spatial impact of the reverb. Great. So we've got that here. And now if I pull this out to here, you can see my reverb appears in the waveform like this. So that way we can just like actually see it. And if I bring this up, you can see the reverb still going kind of quietly there as well. The big takeaways are reverb, a little is a lot. You don't have to do massive, big reverbs for it to sound beautiful and smooth. And most of all, you just want to have a lovely transition before your next bit of the story comes back in. Okay, second technique. We have got the long fade. Perhaps what could seem the least exciting of endings can actually be so lovely. I think like the long fade is underrated. And even if we think about like contemporary pop music, not used very often, but when it is, it can be like nostalgic and beautiful and kind of like takes us out of the song. So that's what we want to do here. We want to kind of like leave a scene slowly and carefully and also highlight kind of the music ending as we're doing that and be intentional about it. So I'm going to work with this scene here. I've got some interview and then I've got this lovely track by our composer, Eliza Niemi, who did the music for this series, a lot of cello and voice, and as well as some drums by Evan Cartwright. So with this piece, the music ends here, but we want the music to end about here where this purple line is. So we need to fade it out. So I'm going to start by just having a little listen to this section and hear what it sounds like leading into it. So we'll start from about here.
I'm sorry.
I mean, it's about like I feel like as a subject, I'm interested in the ethics of documentary making.
Yeah, that's interesting.
This is very comfortable.
Okay, so a few things happening. This scene is ending. This new scene is starting. I'm going to start off by just throwing a marker down there. I'm not even going to name it. I'm going to delete it later. So it's just kind of like a temporary marker of where the new scene is. And that's where I know the music kind of has to be faded out by. And then I'm going to work backwards, look at where the dialogue kind of fades out.
That's interesting.
So about there, I'm going to add another marker. So this is like the space in which the music will be highlighted and also needs to fade out. So it's the time we've got, which is about like, what is that, 12 seconds? Which is nice. That's like a nice long fade. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just like listen to this piece of music and in between those sections and hear how it sounds. And what I'm going to start to look for is where the beats of the song are, so I can follow the beats of the song and apply the fade that way. So let's listen back. So the ones, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So the nice thing with this piece of music, when it's good for an example, is because this cello pluck here essentially happens on the first one, the first beat. And even if you're not super well versed in music, like anybody who can hold a rhythm, clap their hands, you can like feel where that one is. You can feel it in your body, you can feel it in the music. There's a connection there. And also when you're listening, there's a connection too, right? I think that even though so much of sound design is really subconscious, what the listener is doing is just kind of like listening along to the music fading out. And if it cuts in a weird place, what we're doing is we're kind of like bringing the listener out of the world we've created. So I feel like having a nice fade that like follows the timing of the music can be a really beautiful way of like extending the world and keeping the listener in kind of situ with you and the storytelling while at the same time transitioning to a new scene. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make a cut. I am going to cut off the end of this, almost the end of this. I'm going to take the solo off and just hear how it sounds.
This is a very comfortable room.
So we definitely need the music to be out, like essentially here. So if this is the one, that's like a pretty nice place to cut it. Oops, there we go. And I'm going to take this and I'm going to apply a fade across all of these tracks. And you can select them all. And if you just hover over the corner, you can pull that back. So that's applying a fade to 1 bar. That's 2 bars. That's 3 bars. That's 4 bars. And even though it looks like a lot, I'm going to apply the fade. I'm going to try to cross 4 bars to start and just hear how that sounds. Because a nice long fade is subtle and has the, again, impact I was talking about before of transitioning, not too abruptly.
I'm interested in the ethics of documentary making.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Cool. I'm pretty happy with that. I might try it at 3 bars and just kind of see how that sounds. So just pull it back a bit.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Great. 3 sounding really good. So that way we have the kind of end of the drums in that section here. Very soft, but it's still present and it kind of just like fades out nicely and then the room tone of the next scene fades up. So that's the intentionality that I'm talking about, that it's like it fades on beat rather than it kind of being a bit random or later. It kind of like fits within the flow of the music. And again, even though your listener may not be paying attention to this and probably doesn't care, it's more about building that sound world that's like very intentional and thoughtful. And I think like that definitely helps keep everybody who's listening in that world with you. Okay, so my third and final technique for endings is just ending at the end of the song. So that is editing down a song so it specifically in your session, in your work, in your storytelling, it will end where that song ends. Now, I think it can be one of the most beautiful ways to end as you're kind of following the intention of the song. And it also sounds really natural if you can do your fades right, because you're like, oh, the song is specifically composed for this moment or this scene. The downsides are it can be a little bit more technically challenging, especially if you're working across stems with a lot going on. You're going to have to sync up your timing. It's very common, I think, in a theme music, which is the example I'm going to be using in a sec, to get a longer piece of music and then have to like edit that down to 30 seconds. And it is tricky, but it is possible. So let's take a dive in and see if I can provide some tips on how I approach this to make it as smooth as possible. Now, a lot of it can be it's just like listening and trial and error. There's no magic button in terms of what I know that will suddenly be like, oh, you sync the song. But I think what it does is, again, like really builds our relationship to the music and to listening and hearing how we can use the music with more specificity in the work that we have. So it is exciting at the same time, although it can be very frustrating. So let's dive in. We have our tracks here. And right now I'm going to play this back with the theme playing from about here. And this is just the theme song that we use for Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Really beautiful piece of cello music along with drums and lap pats and vocals. So let's play it back. And this is Jess, the host, just announcing the show titles.
This is Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative.
So we can kind of start to get a sense of the song and the timing. And if we look at this and extend it out, the natural end of the song of how it was recorded goes to about here. So it's quite a bit longer than what we need. Ideally, it would be out by the time this yellow line comes in, which gives us like a few seconds of space before Jess's voiceover. So it's like 3 seconds of space before the voiceover comes back in. And so we need to cut this down by like a minute and a half, which is quite significant. To start off, what I usually do with the music is not very eloquent, but it works, which is just cutting out the kind of space between. Now, again, working in Reaper is not destructive, so we can always pull this back out. So it's just kind of a temporary for visual's sake, so I can start to line this up. Now, I'm going to take all my tracks on this side and group them together. That way I can just like move them across the project session a lot more easily, and then I will do the same on this end. So now we're going to try and stitch these together. Okay, so the first thing here I'm going to do is just like listen back to this part and get a sense of what we're working with. So we've got the da, da, da. Now, ideally, that same melody would carry in this next section that we're moving into, and then the song would wrap up. But that is not the case. So what we need to do is kind of start to finesse. So first off, I'm going to get the timing about right. So if we want it out by about...
So why the crisis of...
Yeah, by about there. That's how I know where I kind of want the song to end. So I kind of start with mapping out the ending, and now to actually do the fade across. Whew. So as I listen back, I start to kind of hear the rhythm and the melody and look for moments where I could potentially crossfade across the different sections of the song, while again keeping the rhythm and hopefully not really changing the melody too much, or at least if it's shifting, having it sound really natural. So that section's a nice one to work with, as it's kind of a change. But it doesn't sound, it's like the start of a new section in the song, and it doesn't sound like we're kind of like cutting something off midway through. And that also, so if we got the, let's play that. Okay, so having that's like a little snare sound here. It almost sounds, it's like we're prepping to go into the next section. So if I pull this back, there is no snare sound, but that is okay, because perhaps the one for the next section, if we pull it back, is there. I'll put a little take marker there. Again, don't need to label, just need that for the moment as I kind of line these drums up. Okay, and we've got the one here. So what I'm now going to do is just delete that, and I'm going to try out a crossfade between these two sections. Now, crossfading, if you have a kick drum sound, can be easy as the waveform is quite distinct for it. So it's kind of a combination of listening back and then also seeing where those moments are. And now let's play it back. Okay. So the timing is not perfect in that. But what I did here was possibility. And the possibility is that I think it can happen here. So if I do a longer crossfade, let's hear how that sounds. Okay, so again, not technically sounding the smoothest, but in the song itself, what I'm hearing is that one element in particular is sounding like it's kind of off or faded, and that is this cello rip here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to ungroup this section of the song, and I'm going to give this a longer crossfade than the rest of the elements. Okay, and so I have this crossfade kind of starting. It was luck, but I would have arranged it that way in the end. But where this kick drum beat is, so it's coming in on the beat. Yeah. I think the drums are a bit too splashy with how they're sounding. So I'd probably arrange that a little bit further. Great. Happier with that. And then let's play it back with the voice.
Transformative.
Great. And then let's hear the final out. Nice. So I'm pretty happy with that. If it weren't for the video's sake, I would probably go in and finesse my crossfades a little bit more. But again, I feel like that's kind of combining some of the sound knowledge we've already built up in other skills to listen and have a feel for how the song can come together and, yeah, just really punch where it needs to. Like, it's nice to have something come in punchy right after the host announces the show titles. So that worked out really well with the song. Thanks for joining me on this journey through endings in sound. And the takeaways are, think about it like punctuation. Think about how sound can be used to enhance storytelling and to build into the world that you all are working on together. And sound doesn't need to be something that has to be this huge highlighting moment. It can be really subtle and simple and just accentuate points in the storytelling. The techniques we went over today are reverb tails. We went over using a long fade and then how to edit a piece of music down so it feels like it's specifically kind of composed and ending for that particular moment that you need. So hope you enjoyed this. Do your like and subscribe if you care to join me on more sonic adventures through podcasting, working on sound design for audio in general. But for now, it's time for us to head out for a walk. Oh, I've got an impatient one here. And thank you. See you soon. Bye.